The Australian Army Learn to Learn. We look at Jungle Warfare Doctrine Development in the Second World War.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 118 of the Principles of War podcast, Jungle Warfare Doctrine Development in the Australian Army. Today, I'm very excited to have Dr Adrian Threlfall on the podcast. His PhD was the development of Australian Army Jungle Warfare Doctrine and Training 1941 to 1945. He has a wealth of knowledge about how the Australian Army learnt to learn jungle warfare during the Second World War. And he is the author of the book, Jungle Warriors. This interview is going to be important for a number of reasons. The ability to anticipate likely tasks is critical to setting the troops up for success in combat. At the strategical level, Australia has many countries to the north with large amounts of jungle terrain, and yet the requirements to fight in Malaya, Singapore, Papua, New Guinea, the Dutch East Indies, and many of the island nations to our north seems to have gone completely under the radar, even though the Japanese were the main threat during the interwar period. Learning to learn the lessons of modern combat is a critical skill. Last episode, we discussed innovation and adaptation in Ukraine with UAS combat. Today, we are looking at innovation and adaptation for jungle warfare. This is important looking forward for the Australian Army because it could be possibly faced with combat in very similar jungle terrain. Not only that, but the Army will also need to adapt to fighting on the modern battlefield with advances in electronic warfare, UAS, artificial intelligence, and a range of other technologies. The speed with which Army adapts will be critical to success on the modern battlefield. So let's get into the interview with Dr. Adrian Threlfall. Adrian, welcome to the podcast. Do you want to start off by telling us a little bit about Jungle Warriors and why you wrote it?
Certainly. I'd always been fascinated with the Australian Army in the Second World War, and I'd read broadly. And a lot of the books that I'd read talked about how the Australians had made a remarkably rapid transition to the jungle. So those 6th, 7th and 9th Divisions, 2nd AIF, that had fought in the Middle East, in North Africa, in Greece and Crete and Syria, how those combat-hardened troops had come back and made, I can't remember exactly who it was, but it might have been Lex McCauley, might have been Peter Brune, had written books in the 1990s and regularly talked about the fact that it was a remarkably rapid and almost seamless transition to jungle conditions, and that by the end of the war, Australians were the acknowledged jungle aficionados or jungle fighters extraordinaire. I didn't necessarily disbelieve this, but I've always been more interested in how things happen, I guess, rather than just the what and the when and the where. I thought, all right, if maybe this is true. Maybe the fact that they were combat-hardened soldiers meant that they could transition to fighting in a completely different environment against a completely different enemy. Maybe that was true. But I wanted to find the proof. I wanted to go get to the sources, have a look at the evidence and see what the evidence of both those people who had served, so the men who served in these units, what they said, and also what the official record said about this transition. That was really the drive. As I said, it wasn't really to disprove. I wasn't trying to be negative. I didn't want to say you're all a bunch of liars and you've been suckered in or had the wool pulled over your eyes. But I just wanted to find out, all right, if it was true, then how did it happen? Because any organisation needs to train and prepare for new situations, whether it's a footy team or a telecommunications company or an army. And I wanted to follow that process, I guess, of transition from the desert to the jungle. That was at the heart of my thoughts.
So in your book, you've got a quote from Michael Howard. This is an aspect of military science which needs to be studied above all others in the armed forces. The capacity to adapt oneself to the utterly unpredictable, the utterly unknown. And really, the Australian Army's transition from fighting in the desert and its preparation for fighting the wars that it thought it would fight in the interwar period, that transition to jungle warfare was really quite tortuous, as we've seen from the experience of the militia battalions and 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th during the Kokoda campaign. So what is it that makes Jungle so different?
I think probably at the simplest level, it's the lack of observation. So command, control, communications are all so much more difficult in the jungle. And therefore, commanders have to rely to a greater extent, I think, than any other terrain and environment, have to rely on their junior commanders. There's arguments that people talking about that jungle warfare is a platoon leader's war, or some people saying it's actually at the section level, it's a section commander's war. And I think that's the basic issue, is that obviously as a commander, you hope to be able to, obviously, ideally you've got observation over your forces, so you can actually literally see what they are doing, either with your own eyes and your binoculars, or you can do it on screens to see where they're moving. But if you can't do that, you need to have communications with them. But in the jungle, as the Australians found out very, very quickly, no observation at all. So you can't have visual command of your battlefield, of your force, whether a company or a platoon or a battalion or a brigade, obviously. Then, all right, you fall back on communications, but it doesn't work in the jungle. Radio sets with high humidity and rain and really thick jungle, the radio sets of the day, communication systems don't really work. And once you've lost those two things, for many of the commanders of this period, they're not sure what to fall back on. And even those that have served in the Middle East, I don't know, there's complaints by units that serve in Syria, so the mountains in Syria and the mountains in Greece. And there's a nice quote from a sergeant who was in, I think, the 2nd 5th or the 2nd 6th Infantry Battalion, so a Victorian Infantry Battalion that fights in North Africa, then fights in Greece, comes back, and some of them serve in Syria as well. And this bloke said, I thought that half the mountains of the world were in Syria and the other half were in Greece. But when I got back to New Guinea, I realised that I knew nothing at all about mountains. And there's complaints. The 108 sets that they're using in the mountains of Syria and Greece don't perform. They work when there's line of sight, basically. And if there isn't line of sight and you're in a valley and you've got another unit on the next valley, you can't talk to them, even though it might only be a kilometre away. And those are those main issues. Command, control, communications, lack of observation. Everything stems from that.
So the first Australians to fight in the jungle were the 2 brigades of the 8th Division. How were they prepared to fight in the jungle, and how well did they do?
They have a long time to train. 8th Division, obviously, they think they're going to join their comrades. Obviously, let's go back, before December the 7th, 1941. So they assume, as their comrades have in 6 Div and then 7 Div and then 9 Div, that they're doing the same thing. There's trains rolling into Sydney in late 40 and early 41 from different places. And they've got chalked on the sides, Berlin or bust, Adolf, here we come. They're thinking they're going to go to the Middle East and to North Africa. They've trained. They're trained infantry, and obviously this infantry division. But I would argue that a lot of their training is based on 2 false premises. 1, that they think they're going to the Middle East and North Africa. And 2, that their training is not fit for purpose. It's really based on the understanding of people like General Bennett. That is a reflection of their experiences of the First World War. The training in the interwar period hasn't been great for many Australian officers. No real opportunities to go to sort of equivalent of a staff and command college, whether in the United Kingdom, say Sandhurst, or at Quetta in what's now Pakistan, in India. And so they're digging trench lines, and they're doing the basic training. They can march an awfully long way. Route marches, fitness, rifle firing on using their 303s on ranges. And so, your basic training, really. When they get to Malaya, obviously very quickly, they realise, all right, we've got to do things differently. And so the brigade major, they go on Bennett is rather busy fighting his own battles at that higher level. And so people like brigade majors and battalion commanders, as would be understandable, go off and approach other British and Indian units that are already serving in Malaya and basically try to find out from them, what are they doing? How are they getting ready to fight? They find out pretty quickly that only 1 unit is actually going out into the jungles. 2nd Battalion of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders is doing that. And they very quickly start to make connections with that unit and that proves useful. The other thing they get, the way of soldiers being rat bags sometimes. One Australian soldier from, I think he's outside of Sydney, they go into the hold of the Queen Mary, which is the big, huge liner that's carrying them to Malaya. Because actually, for a very long time, they don't realise where they're going. They sail away from Sydney down to Melbourne, sail across the Bight, dock in Fremantle, heading across the Indian Ocean. So they're still assuming that they're going to the Middle East. And suddenly the boat turns north, the convoy turns north. And so they're heading up straight through the Dutch East Indies and up to Singapore. And some of these young soldiers get down into the hold for some reason. I don't know what they're doing down there, but they get down into the hold and they find a crate that says AIF Malaya. They break open this crate, and inside they find little booklets, 29-page booklet, and it says Notes for Malaya. And they're interested in this. I think they get hustled out of there pretty quickly. But once the units are in Malaya, this manual, this little document, it's only pamphlet size, sort of booklet size, so not A4 or foolscap or anything like that. It's only this kind of size, so tiny little booklet, 29 pages, that it does contain some really useful notes about serving in tropical areas. It's created by the War Office in Britain, but based, I gather, created by officers in the British Indian Army, so to prepare their troops for when they go across to Malaya. And this little military training pamphlet is the basis of training programs that the Australians, so that 8th Division, uses throughout their time in Malaya. It's a good little booklet. It doesn't sugarcoat things. It really talks about how tough the Japanese, and that's the assumption, obviously, that it's going to be the Japanese, how tough the Japanese are. It says things like they don't take prisoners, they will not surrender, they don't need a great big logistical tail. They will fight to the death. They will get through any obstacles. Their men are battle hardened. They've served for years in China. So it really cuts to the chase. As I said, it's only short, but it sort of dispels those myths that, I don't know, things like the Japanese can't fly at night time. They've all got great big Coke bottle thick glasses. They've got buck teeth. They've been defeated or haven't been able to beat the Chinese for years and years of combat in China. They're not an army that is worthy of fear. This little booklet basically says rubbish. These people, if this army, if we have to fight them, is going to be a lot harder than we had thought. With this training pamphlet, they then basically, the units are sent out into the jungle. The Australians are told, just go and work out, what do you do in the jungle? How do you move in the jungle? Because for many of them, I guess it's, the first problem is not fighting in the jungle. It's moving and living and surviving and navigating in the jungle. I mean, in Malaya, and also obviously when to get to the islands of the Pacific, maps are either non-existent or they're inaccurate. So you can't see anything. It doesn't matter if you're up on a ridge line. Maybe if you're in a ridge line in Greece or in Crete or in Syria, you can see what's happening around you. But a ridge line in Malaya or in New Guinea is irrelevant because it's still covered in triple canopy jungle. You still can't see anything. So the infantry, and in particular the artillery are tearing their hair out when they're in Malaya. As I said, their maps are useless. They spend all their time doing survey work and trying to create gridded maps. But again, there's no comms. If you don't have big enough areas to put a whole field regiment, so you have to break them up into batteries or break them up into sort of two 25-pounders. If you've even got 25-pounders, and many of these units don't at the start, a lot of them have captured Italian artillery pieces that were shipped over from the Middle East, from North Africa. And even if they've got artillery pieces with ammunition, it's the comms. And yeah, you can't talk to the infantry battalions that you're supposed to be supporting to provide fire support. Everybody falls back on signal cables and is what you have to use. And units find that instead of the sort of 8 to 10 miles worth of signal cable they've been allocated, by the end of the campaigns, they've sort of scrounged 50, 60, 80 miles worth of cables. But that needs an awful lot of transport to cart it around. That's bloody heavy. That's an incredible point that highlights the importance of getting comms in the jungle. The fact that they would go to the logistics effort of getting so much cable. Yeah, they basically, begged, borrowed or stole it. I mean, admittedly, in North Africa, units, particularly, I guess, defending in Tobruk and other places, distances between your various company positions are a lot more spread out. Obviously, you don't clump together in the desert because one artillery shell could wipe out a platoon. So you are more spread out. So they do spread out and use cable as well. But you've got other means of communication. Whereas, as I said, in the jungles, you have to just rely on signal cable because nothing else works. And even the fallbacks like heliographs and Lucas lamps and things like that, none of them work because they all rely on line of sight as well and observation. So the only thing that works is signal cable. And as I'm sure you'll be well aware, if you've got cables lying between all your positions back to BH or back to CHQ and then back to BHQ, and then obviously back again to Brigade HQ, the likelihood that they're going to be broken, either inadvertently, trucks driving over them, tanks driving over them, enemy artillery landing on them. In Malaya, the funniest one I found was when the Australians strung up cables up in trees instead of down on the ground because they were getting broken all the time, baboons would swing off them and break the cables. No, how do you plan for baboons?
That's not kind of the thing that you would think about in your military appreciation.
No, definitely not.
Was the 8th Division able to adapt to jungle fighting, given the limited amount of time that they had between their initial contacts, because they were a fair way down in the south of the Malayan Peninsula? Were they able to adapt in the time between that and the final defeat in Singapore?
This is one of the problems. I would argue that 8th Div should have been one of the first units to see action, to give themselves time to do that adaptation. Most of the Australian units don't see action, and most of the Italian battalions don't see action until between the 7th and the 11th of January. So it's a month, 42. So it's a month after, obviously, the 7th and 8th of December 41. So a month after the Japanese have invaded, before those Australian units see action. Australian battalion commanders and the brigade commanders in particular are heading north, going up and talking to their comrades who are desperately fighting further north up the peninsula and trying to bring those lessons and learnings back. But it is a pretty chaotic and disorganised retreat at times. And yeah, many of those British units are not prepared, as I said, except you'd argue for the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. So they do bring back some lessons, but it's hard to really see much changes occurring or any changes occurring in any preparations or training that Australians are doing in sort of early to mid-January. And thence, once action is joined, there is really no chance at all. And units are moving, dispositions are changing. I'd argue that at times Bennett's dispositions of his forces are not. There's a really good article in, I can't remember what year it is, but I think it's the 2009 Australian Army Journal that looks at, I think it's called Outwitted, Outgeneraled, Outfought. And it looks at Bennett and Percival. And it's a really good article that basically looks at how not to command in a tactical withdrawal. It's almost an object lesson in how not to do a tactical withdrawal. So I don't think there's a lot of learning happening in that retreat, or in that tactical withdrawal by all those British forces, and not much being passed on to the Australians. And again, once you get to December 7th, 41, obviously before then, as is the practice, every battalion, every brigade should be sending copies of its war diary and training diary up until December 7th back to headquarters LHQ in Melbourne. And that is happening. Before December 7th, that's certainly happening. And there's lots of interesting lessons being discussed and suggestions for other units. But obviously, I guess from 22nd Brigade arrives in Malaya in February, 27th Brigade arrives in August, this is 1941, and I guess in the same period, 6, 7 and 9 Division are serving in the Middle East. And I imagine that they have no interest in what's happening in Malaya. They're training that another unit is doing, or another division is doing in the backwater like Malaya before the war starts in the Pacific. And I imagine those reports are probably just gathering dust at LHQ in this period. So no, I would have said, apart from, as I said, that little document that's created or created before that. So it's stamp dated 1940. Can't work out exactly when in 1940, that little tactical notes for Malaya. That's the only real lessons that is of use. So there's little tactical innovation happening in that period. It's just a bit of like warning that this is what the Jap will do. They will hit you hard from the front, and then they will outflank you and try to they won't care that it's swamps or jungles or mangroves. They will head out into the swamps and the mud and circle around in and hit your line of communication 5, 6, 8 kilometres further south. And that then, instead of units basically going into a sort of an all-round defence, that precipitates withdrawal. And that happens over and over again. As soon as the commander, whether a battalion commander or a company commander, learns that he has enemy formations in his rear, it's almost a disorganised rout or retreat. And this is the Indian forces and British forces, not as much for Australian forces, but certainly, once they're outflanked, the panic does set in.
So the lessons that were learned, particularly even if it was just about the Japanese way of war, how did those lessons come back to Australia? What was it that was learnt from the disaster that befell the 8th Division?
Well, I'd have said that the two things happen. British command is criticised a lot for what it does and doesn't do in the Malayan campaign. But the one thing I would give them credit for is realising that the writing was on the wall as it moves into mid-January. And so what they do is they send, I guess it's kind of like a left out of battle party, but what they do is they send out a brigade commander, a battalion commander, a company commander, a platoon commander, a section leader. They send them out of battle so that they can write up their reflections from their point of view and from the experience they have had to provide that to others who are coming after them. Australia doesn't do that. That should have happened. We all know that Bennett manages to make his escape, causes obviously great controversy, and a handful of others do as well. So when Bennett gets back to Australia, he basically put in a room for several weeks with these other escapees, and they write up their experiences. There is a company commander, but all of these men, from what I gather, are from only one battalion, from the 2nd 19th. So there's a company commander, there's, I think, either the 2IC or the IC of the transport platoon, there is a sergeant, and there's another lieutenant. So there's a handful of men, and they do write up what they felt or what they saw, what they did when they were in Malaya. It ends up as a 49-page report. I don't find it of much use at all. There's 1.5 pages that is devoted to jungle training or preparing troops to serve in the jungle. And most of the lessons are really, I guess, if we're going to defend Australia from an invasion, they might have been some useful suggestions there, but there's very little about actually preparing to fight in the jungle. So I don't think it's a great document. Of those British officers who, as I said, are sent out, and other men who are sent out, Colonel Stewart, who'd been in charge of the Argylls, he writes up a document. And the most interesting one to me is Colonel Francis Brink, who's US Army. He's an observer. He's been sent over there by the Americans, and he, before the war breaks out, and he serves for several months in Malaya and down into Singapore, and then he's evacuated before the fall of Singapore. He also writes up a really interesting document. It's about 30 pages also. And those two documents, really, Stewart's document and Brink's document, are far more useful in providing an overview and an understanding of what had happened in the Malayan campaign. And Brink actually, interestingly, incorporates, I'd have to go to the archives in the United States to find this out, but he incorporates lessons that from the Philippines and also from the Dutch East Indies. It's trying to be a more holistic overview. It's not just a one campaign overview. He's actually able to access, as I said, I'm not exactly sure how, but access documentation and reports from those other two battlefronts where obviously other forces are opposing the Japanese. That's sort of February, March, April 1942 that they're doing this. Admittedly, the same time Bennett is writing his report, but as far as I'm concerned, it's a bit harsh, but it's really a waste of time. It's Stewart's and Brink's reports that are far more useful. And that you can prove that, I think, by the distribution of those reports and who writes about them. People do receive Bennett's report. It is translated into what's called MTPs, military training pamphlets. They're only short, sort of 10 to 12 pages, sometimes only 8, and they come out every month. So they're coming out in December 41 and then January, February, March, April, and continuing. The ones for March, April, May, basically a 3-volume or sort of serialised version of Bennett's document. But you read reports later on and you read accounts of battalion commanders and company commanders, and they're basically saying this is not much use. Whereas their reports are saying that Stewart's report and Brink's report is what they use. And this is proven by 6 Div on Ceylon, and when the other units get back to 6 and 7 Div get back to Australia in sort of the middle of 42 in those reports as well, which we can touch on.
Well, so the next battles were really the bird forces, which were horribly outnumbered and ill-prepared. So there wasn't a lot that could have been learnt from them, really, or was there?
It's interesting. You're right. They are overwhelmed within 2 to 3 days, basically, sometimes even less than that. But in their training periods, a couple of their commanders, particularly Jeffrey Yule, Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Yule, he writes back and he's quite insistent about the changes that he thinks are necessary. One of the first things that he says is we need uniforms. We need camouflage uniforms. He's serving alongside the Dutch, so he's seeing what the Dutch in Timor are wearing, and says we need things like this. We need a jungle green sort of a uniform or a camouflage uniform. Can we just acquire some from the Dutch if we can't get our own? That doesn't happen. Obviously, one of the other changes or one of the other suggestions, and 8th Div makes this too. There are actually some really good war diary reports from the middle period of 1941, so the training period, for suggestions back to Australia about camouflage uniforms, about what today I guess we'd say sort of call immediate action drills. So instead of the prone, standing and kneeling at 100, 200 and 400 yards, immediate action, or they often call it snap shooting, or basically and stalker courses is the other thing they call it. So sort of walking through the jungle with your primary weapon and have targets popping up from 5 metres away, 10 metres away, 20 metres away, and making quick snapshots on those targets. 8th Div is suggesting that we do that, or that this is very useful. And as I said, reports from those units that are sent to Timor, Ambon and New Britain, are making suggestions that, and helmets, they all say get rid of helmets. You're walking through the jungle with a helmet on your head in the tropics. One, you're getting heat stroke because you've got this metal lid on your head that you're sweating unbelievably under it. And in the jungle, kind of almost counterintuitive, sound travels. So metal twigs whacking on your helmet, on a metal tin rim of a helmet, travels a long way. So they're making suggestions that you get rid of the helmets. We don't need helmets in the jungle. We need camouflage uniforms. We need firearms that are shorter. They're arguing that the 303 is just too long, particularly if you've got a bayonet attached to it. It's nearly 1.5 meters long. It's I think one of the soldiers wrote, we found it too tangly in the jungle. And you can see what he means, sort of in vines and twigs and things hanging down. You're probably knocking against and brushing against things all the time with your rifle. And automatic weapons. That comes up over and over again. We need a greater preponderance of automatic weapons for those contacts that happen so quickly and out of nowhere. Even if the scout gets hit first and drops, the rest of us then need to be able to just lay down suppressive fire to keep the Japs' heads down, so that we can then, your commander can make a quick assessment. Do you assault? Do you pull back? Do you flank left, right? What do you do? So these suggestions are being made, as I said, by those units on the bird forces, but also had been made in Malaya as well. So their reports are coming back to LHQ in Melbourne about suggestions for changes to be made.
We'll leave the interview there and continue on next week with our interview with Dr Adrian Threlfall. He really does have an encyclopedic knowledge about this topic, and I think it's really fascinating to hear how those lessons are slowly assimilated and put together into a cohesive doctrine that then troops can be trained in and to become competent and then expert in jungle warfare.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.